Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of AIJAC Live Online. My name is Joel Burney, and it is fantastic to have you with us this evening. Special shout out to our international guests who have been able to join with us this evening. Thank you very much for joining. We're happy to have you with us. It's great that we have Tal here tonight. Just a few housekeeping items to get through. It gives me great pleasure to advertise our next webinar, which will be with former Minister of Justice and Attorney General for Canada, Irwin Cotler. Irwin will be joined by well-known Canadian human rights advocate, Dr. Karen Mock. They will be discussing the 20 years since the World Conference Against Racism, which was hosted in Durban in 2001. This webinar will take place on Wednesday, the 6th of October at noon. So an invitation will be in your inbox tomorrow morning. That's Wednesday, 6th of October at noon. That's a noon webinar due to the time difference with Canada. And that will be with Irwin Cotler and Dr. Karen Mock. As usual, ladies and gentlemen, tonight's webinar will have a Q&A so you will use the raised hand feature. I'll go through the specific details as to how to do that. But please, during Tal's presentation, don't be shy. Prepare your questions. You can also include a question in the chat if you're a bit camera shy as well. Now to our main event. Our good friend, Dr. Tal Becker, who grew up in Australia, serves as a legal advisor of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is a veteran member of successive Israeli peace negotiation teams. Most recently, he played an instrumental role in negotiating and drafting the Abraham Accords, the historic peace and normalization agreements between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. He has decades of experience on the front lines of many of Israel's most pressing diplomatic, legal, and policy challenges, and is the key behind-the-scenes representative for Israel in a wide variety of contexts. Among numerous previous positions, Tal has been a senior Washington Institute for Near East Policy, senior policy advisor to Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs, a lead negotiator and drafter in peace talks, director of the International Law Department at the Israeli Foreign Ministry, counsel to Israel's UN mission to New York, and an international law expert for the Israel Defense Force. Tal also serves as a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where he leads educational initiatives on Israel and the Jewish movement, including the popular Engaging Israel series. He earned his doctorate from Columbia University, and among numerous scholarly awards, he is the winner of the Rabin Peace Prize and the 2007 Guggenheim Prize for Best International Law Book for his book, Terrorism and the State. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's topic is 1 year of the Abraham Accords, their impact and future. I would now like to hand over to AIJAC's Dr. Colin Rubenstein to say a few words.
Thanks very much, Joel. And of course, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Tal Becker this evening. As Joel has clearly pointed out, he's had so far an extraordinarily impressive career, going from Melbourne through Monash and Israel, and to become really a key player in Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in the development and in the evolution and the application of Israel's foreign policy. It's really a stellar career. His role at the United Nations stood out as being exceptional. He was pretty popular there as well, a remarkable achievement. His role in the peace negotiations, extremely important. And of course, the focus of tonight's discussion, the historic Abraham Accords, it's one in which Tal also played a very significant role indeed. Those accords are, of course, celebrating their first anniversary this Wednesday, September 15. And amidst all the doom and gloom we see around us, especially in the Middle East, the Abraham Accords do represent a tremendous ray of light and hope. There is gloom, of course, as we know. We've just seen the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. We've seen the chaotic, damaging nature of the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Taliban takeover there, a shot in the arm for jihadists everywhere, unfortunately, and for terror-supporting countries like Iran and their proxies, and for states rivaling the United States and trying to fill, and successfully, unfortunately, in many cases, the vacuum left by the United States, referring to Russia and increasingly China. But against all of that gloom and doom, we have the shining light of the Abraham Accords. And certainly something very historic, very reassuring, a case of moderate Arab actors coming together with Israel to protect and further their own interests in this very difficult region. And so what we want to know from Tal is whether this alliance or this accord could really develop into a moderate alliance, helping to fill that vacuum to secure those countries against the threats and the dangers represented by the strengthening axis between Iran and its proxies, and even Turkey in this case, and the effects of other strong powers in the region, as I've mentioned before, be they Russia and even China. So the Abraham Accords, we know, are yielding tremendous dividends already. They're helping to transform the region in a very positive way. They could develop actually into an alliance, not just an accord. But really, we're asking Tal this evening to enlighten us about the Abraham Accords, what's been achieved, how they're traveling, the possibilities they've created and already achieved, and potentially the future role they have in changing the Middle East landscape, hopefully for the better. Tal, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Joel. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm very appreciative of AIJAC's work and happy to be involved in AIJAC's event. My special sympathies for anyone in lockdown at the moment. We're watching from here the situation in Australia as well. Just to say a little bit about my own role. So I'm a kind of veteran of Israeli-Palestinian talks in particular. I used to joke that my record is just a resume of failure because I've been involved in every failed round of negotiations with the Palestinians. And my involvement in drafting and negotiating the Abraham Accords was for me very meaningful, given how much I've been involved in successive failed efforts. It was nice to be involved in drafting something that was finally signed. And hopefully, and I'll talk a bit about this, it will have in the end a positive impact on the Israeli-Palestinian relationship as well. I'm talking to you from my office in the Foreign Ministry, so I thought I'd just start with a bit of show and tell. These are actually the pens that each agreement was signed with, the UAE and so on, except for one. This is a pen that I was given many years ago when I was in Morocco. I was presented as one of the people involved in drafting the agreement with the Palestinians, and the Moroccans said, use this pen in order to draft the agreement with the Palestinians. And what's funny about that is that this pen has never worked. The other pens have worked, but this pen, unfortunately, I've never gotten to work. Hopefully it'll work one day. What I thought I'd do briefly is talk a little bit about the dynamics that brought about the Accords and something of their significance. Perhaps just to begin and say, you know, we love to, when an event happens, we love to draw a straight line of cause and effect, to be able to say, this was caused by that. I think when it comes to the Abraham Accords, it's a little trickier to do that. There are many, many factors that were at play. There were strategic factors that have been spoken about in terms of the sense of countries aligned together in certain interests, particularly against the threat of Iran, the sense that there's less US presence in the region and the need to address those challenges directly. There is the fact that you know, Israel, particularly the Foreign Ministry, worked very hard in cultivating these relationships over many, many years. In fact, something like 2 decades of relations behind the scenes, in the sense that though the Abraham Accords looked like they were kind of came out of the blue, they were actually the culmination of a long product of relationships. There was the courage of the leaders themselves that made the decision, particularly Mohammed bin Zayed of the UAE. You know, Israel obviously wants to normalize its relations with these countries, but the willingness of the Arab states to do so, I think, was significant. The contribution of the previous US administration and the willingness to really invest in that was also a major factor. I just wanted to point out perhaps one other factor that people don't take into account. And I think because the Middle East is such a bizarre place, we don't always think about it in this way. But it might be that what is unnatural is the fact that we haven't had relations, not the fact that we did create those relations. Most countries in foreign policy, as Colin will tell you, tend to pursue their interests. That's what they do. And in our relations, particularly with the Gulf states, the convergence of interests was very striking. And it came to a point where it seemed, at least to me, unnatural for those interests to be held hostage to a separate issue that frankly was not particularly progressing. I'm talking about the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. And so perhaps it's worth beginning to think about this as the natural thing is for countries who share interests, share objectives, share concerns to cooperate. And the unnatural thing is for them not to cooperate. And in a way, I feel like there was a course correction into the natural course of events with the Israel and particularly the UAE, Bahrain, and later Morocco in that respect. Perhaps I'll say something also about the role of the lawyer and the role that I played. I was intensely involved in the drafting and negotiating of the agreements. And I wanted to say perhaps something about the way in which that drafting process took place. First, one thing that people often mention is that, you know, we called the agreement between Israel and the UAE a peace treaty. It's called a treaty of peace, diplomatic relations and full normalization. And some have commented, well, why is it a peace treaty if you didn't have a conflict beforehand? So perhaps I'll just say that from a legal perspective, there are quite a few precedents of agreements being called peace treaties between states who were not previously in conflict. There's an example between, for instance, Argentina and Chile, between China and Japan previously, and others. And I think actually it's interesting because labeling it peace gives us an opportunity to talk about the meaning of peace, not just as being the end of conflict or the cessation of hostilities, but imagining a relationship that is full and rich and vibrant and open. And I think in a way, calling it a peace treaty gave us a way to expand and deepen the very idea of what it is we're trying to create with the neighboring states in the region. That also, I think, touches on the dynamic we found in the negotiating room itself, in the efforts themselves. As you all know, our agreements with Egypt and Jordan, our peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan are very important agreements. They're strategic agreements, but traditionally, or in our experience, they haven't been followed by a kind of relationship between the peoples. They're described often as kind of a cold peace or a peace between the governments, but not that warmth of relationship. And what was so striking in our dynamics, particularly with the UAE, with Bahrain and Morocco, was that the negotiations themselves immediately moved to how do we create a warm, peaceful relationship? How do we essentially unleash the private sector and the capacities of people to interact one with the other as part of these agreements? And the lawyers, you know, I found in my career, sometimes lawyers get brought into a room in order to complicate things, in order to kind of create constructive ambiguity so that nobody knows exactly what was decided. And sometimes lawyers get brought into a room in order to translate an idea into something practical, in order to make something implementable. And in this situation, it was very much what we found, that what we were being asked to do was to immediately give detailed, concrete effect to this new relationship that we were developing between the states. And it's not by accident that after the peace treaty and initial joint communique with Bahrain, we immediately went to work in creating the infrastructure of a relationship. And that means aviation agreements first and foremost, so that people can fly back and forward, visa agreements, investment agreements, a lot of financial agreements that enable essentially people like me in the public sector to move out of the way and enable the relations to develop between the peoples. And I think what we've seen is despite Corona and the difficulties, there's been an amazing really growth, not just economically, but also in the connections between the two societies, obviously in tourism and so on. So what I think struck me the most about the dynamics in the room and the efforts to reach this is that Israel's enthusiasm to produce a relationship with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, of two countries really interested in a fruitful relationship was matched by the enthusiasm of the other side. And the kind of trauma and emotion and difficulty that's associated naturally with peace negotiations with countries you've been in conflict with or entities you've been in conflict with, such as the Palestinian, in the Palestinian case, was not evident here. Just to say a little story, the foreign ministry forces me to have a Twitter account, which I'm not a big fan of, but I have one anyway. And one of the delegates from one of the Gulf countries, from Bahrain, came to visit me in Israel. And he said, Tal, I'd love a photo to put on your Twitter account of the two of us. So we just took a photo here in my office. And as we were leaving, he said, you know, Tal, the truth is I really wanted a photo with an Israeli flag. And we just took a photo against the wall of my office. I wanted a photo with the Israeli flag, and we had run out of time. He had to leave. And I thought to myself, I've been doing this for about 30 years. I can't remember any Arab diplomat ever saying I would like a photo with an Israeli flag. And for me, that was a very interesting kind of symbol of the enthusiasm we were feeling, I think, also from the other side. I'd like to say a few things about the significance of these agreements more strategically, particularly in the line of what Colin was mentioning. And I'll touch on a few aspects of it. So when the initial announcement of the relations between Israel and the UAE came out, I was tasked with drafting the first draft of the agreement. And I thought to myself, I'm going to try to put in a clause that is important to me, and I put it in the preamble, and it reads like this, off the top of my head: recognizing that the Jewish and Arab peoples are descendants of a common ancestor, Abraham, and in that spirit, committed to fostering a Middle East based on mutual understanding, tolerance, and respect, or something like that. And I put in that language because I'm a veteran of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, where the idea of Jewish peoplehood and the idea that the Jewish people belong in this part of the world has been so difficult to achieve. And I thought, what would it be like if this agreement were able to contain a recognition that both the Jewish people and the Arab peoples belong? And I wasn't sure, frankly, whether this language would be accepted by the Emirati side. And when I sent it off to Washington and to Abu Dhabi, and this language came back without a comment. And when that happened, I realized something quite significant had happened, because here we had, I think really for the first time, an Arab state willing to talk about essentially the indigenousness of the Jewish people in the Middle East. A willingness to say that Jews belong here. Obviously, Muslims belong here, Christians belong here, and we need to take responsibility for how we live together in that way. And you know, when I think about Israel's challenges at the moment, in a way, it feels like Israel kind of oscillates between these two poles. There's the campaign to essentially criminalize Israel, which you see at the International Criminal Court in aspects of the BDS movement, in this language of apartheid and all this kind of stuff that is used essentially to demonize and delegitimize the very idea, I think, in large aspects of Jewish self-determination here, and to present the Zionism itself as a kind of criminal enterprise. And then at the other extreme, criminalization, you have normalization. And you have essentially statements from more and more Arab states in the region that say, no, the Jewish people belong here, and Israel is an integral part of the Middle East. And I think the first order of significance of these agreements, beyond other aspects that foreign policy people talk about, is actually in that ability to kind of create that paradigm of the belongingness of Jews and Arabs in the Middle East. In a way, Israel often has presented itself as a kind of a representative of the Judeo-Christian civilization. And to an extent, that's true. But in a way, the Abraham Accords represent a different statement, that we are part of also what you might call the Abrahamic civilization, or the Jewish-Muslim, the Judeo-Muslim civilization. In other words, people whose stories are embedded and part of the Middle East. And I think the statement of Arab states like Bahrain and the UAE, essentially saying we see the Jewish people as integral to the Middle East, is one of the most important pushbacks against that effort of delegitimization. I remember in one of the meetings in Abu Dhabi, one of the senior Emirati ministers said, one of our problems in the UAE is we don't have enough synagogues. Another kind of statement which is quite surprising to an Israeli ear and really represents the kind of moderate form of Islam and the idea of coexistence that I think the Emirates and the other Gulf states very much want to promote in the face of what Colin was describing, which is obviously a very, very virulent and dangerous forces of extremism in our region. So that's one thing I wanted to focus on. The second are just the obvious benefits of this relationship from a bilateral perspective. When you read the agreements, they are really about the building of a healthy relationship between two countries. In the last 6 months, we've had, I think, over $600 million in trade, over 250,000 tourists despite Corona, and just a kind of wellspring of potential. I think the sky is the limit of these relationships, and just in terms of the benefits they will bring in basic cultural, economic terms, is very significant. A third point I'd want to make about the significance relates to the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. There's been a lot of discussion about how normalization and the Abraham Accords interact with the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, and I'd like to say a little bit about that. On the Israeli side, as some of you may have heard me in AIJAC talks in the past say, I often think that one of the biggest challenges in the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic is not how do you produce change, but how do you produce a belief in the possibility of change. And I think particularly the Israeli public over many years, has kind of become kind of convinced that change isn't possible. In other words, that the hostility towards Israel is somehow embedded in the reality of the Middle East. The experiences, particularly of the Second Intifada, of Israel making offers that essentially are rejected, or the withdrawal from Gaza, which from an Israeli perspective produced, the rise of Hamas or the empowerment of Hamas and missiles on Israeli towns, which we're still dealing with today, has really entrenched an experience which resonates in part throughout Jewish history, that the hostility towards the Jewish people is something immutable. You can't do anything about it. And that produces, I think, a kind of pessimism about the capacity to actually make the Middle East a place where there is coexistence and peace. And I think, without being naive about it, one of the most dramatic effects of the Abraham Accords is that they shake the conviction that necessarily the hostility towards Israel is something that cannot be changed. There are obviously irreconcilable forces in the Middle East that we need to confront. We talk about Hezbollah and Hamas, and of course the regime in Tehran and others. But there are also forces in the Middle East which I think have demonstrated a willingness to move towards coexistence, not that immutable hostility. And we need to be smart enough to know how to leverage that and how to pick up on that and how to see the opportunity in that. And I am actually quite hopeful, for all the pessimism that it's around, that the Abraham Accords and hopefully the expansion to other countries of normalization will make the feeling, will create this dynamic within Israeli society that change is possible. And while we need to confront the enemies of peace and the enemies of Israel, we also need to empower and embrace those who are committed to coexistence. On the Palestinian side, I would say that, everyone knows the initial reaction of the Palestinians to the normalization agreements was very harsh. I think that's been tempered a little, though it's difficult to read exactly why. But I want to say two things I think that are promising from the Palestinian perspective in terms of a Palestinian engagement with Israel. The first is, if you look at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, I feel that very often Arab states essentially said to the Palestinians, you go talk to those Israelis, and we're going to hang back and kind of condemn you, or just be silent, and made the Palestinians essentially be the ones who had to be, in quotation marks, brave to talk to the Israelis, to legitimize the Israelis. What happens when Israelis and Arabs, Israelis and Muslims, Israeli Jews and Muslims talking to each other becomes a normal thing? and Israelis, that kind of interaction becomes normal. You legitimize the very idea of dialogue with Israel in ways that I think can make a future Palestinian leader need to be less courageous in order to engage in that process. In other words, really flipping on its head, as the Abraham Accords did, that idea of the Arab Peace Initiative, that somehow the normalization would be this kind of pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And rather than that, use normalization as a way to legitimize the very idea of dialogue and coexistence so that Palestinians would not be stigmatized for moving towards dialogue. I think that that is a potential. It's not yet fulfilled, but it is a potential that the Abraham Accords have in them. And the other is, I think, the opportunity that is available through the Abraham Accords for the Palestinians, should they choose so, to join this process, to become part of this dynamic. And I hope eventually we'll come to the point where the Palestinian people essentially say to their leadership, we do not want to miss out on the opportunities that these kind of relationships have. And this leads me to a kind of final kind of strategic comment. If you look at the Middle East from like 40,000 feet, what you see is essentially zones of chaos and extremism and zones of relative order and stability with potential for economic growth. We have the catastrophe in Lebanon. We have the threat posed by Iran to so many parts of the world, so many parts of the Middle East as well. Obviously, the situation in Syria, the situation in Gaza, situation in Iraq, the situation in Yemen, the situation in Libya. You have all these zones of kind of chaos and disorder. And you have, as Colin mentioned, the beginning of a kind of arc, perhaps, of countries who would like to see a different Middle East, committed to stability, moderation, coexistence, economic prosperity. And you can see Jordan and Egypt, Israel, Morocco, the UAE, Bahrain, potentially, if you take it across the Mediterranean, also to Greece and Cyprus and other countries, you can see a kind of battle between these two forces. And the Abraham Accords is a critical component in trying to expand that. Minister Lapid yesterday, Foreign Minister Lapid yesterday gave a speech about Gaza. And one of the things he said was that he felt that the Palestinians, essentially both in Gaza and the West Bank, have a decision to make in a way about whether they're going to try to move towards joining that growing relationship of stability and moderation, or whether they're going to be in the area of Islamic radicalism. And I think that that's a key kind of crossroads that we find ourselves in. I wanted to say a word about the sustainability of the agreements. I think, this was it looks like these were agreements between a Jewish state and a Muslim state, but it was a Catholic marriage, in the sense that the two states have made a strategic decision, Israel and the UAE, and obviously with Bahrain and Morocco as well. Sudan, we're moving forward with as well. A strategic decision that isn't easily undone. It was tested during the recent Gaza conflict. And I think there were some people who questioned whether the Gaza conflict would shake the relationships. And what we saw, in fact, I think, was a doubling down in those relationships. And pretty much a week after the Gaza conflict ended, there was a double taxation agreement, a very significant one, signed between Israel and the UAE to enable investment between each society. And I think the Gulf states' investment in coexistence, their rejection of extremism, has weathered the storm of the Gaza conflict. We had Minister Lapid, visit already the UAE and Morocco, hopefully Bahrain soon. We have embassies already and ambassadors, an exchange of ambassadors. Very interestingly, my Director General, Alon Ushpiz, I don't know if any of you saw this, but we had the Bahraini Director General here, and they went deep sea diving in Rosh Hanikra. And you have these lovely Twitter photos of the Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry and of the Bahraini Foreign Ministry in their diving suits, diving in Rosh Hanikra with a Bahraini flag and an Israeli flag. And it made me joke to our Director General, I don't know which other Director Generals of which other foreign ministries we do extreme sports with. We don't go bungee jumping with the Director General of any other foreign ministry that I know of. And it really is a symbol of the intimacy of those relationships. To wrap up, I wanted to say, and before we open for questions, something about going forward. Israel is working very diligently together with the new administration, not just on deepening the existing relationships, looking at how we can expand them, and looking at ways also where we can improve conditions, particularly in the West Bank, stabilize the situation in Gaza if possible. And I think this is just the beginning of a process that we've invested a lot in over many years, and is now really bearing fruit in terms of its strategic value. I think a great symbol of the Abraham Accords is actually Abraham's tent. We know in the Midrash, in the Jewish commentary, it describes how Abraham was known as for his hachnasat orchim, what we call the way in which he received guests. And it describes his tent. The commentary, the Jewish commentary, describes Abraham's tent as being open on all four sides, so that guests could come from any direction. And Abraham, I think, is in a way a real model of what we're trying to create through these agreements, a tent under which those committed to a Middle East that moves away from radicalism and towards coexistence, a tent in which the Jewish people are accepted as inherent part of this part of the world, is welcoming to all people. And I think for the first time in quite a long time, we have a real expression of what an alternative Middle East could look like. And once you have that, it's no longer a kind of fantasy. It's something you can actually work towards. And that, I think, was the great flaw of the Arab Peace Initiative, because beyond, questions about different language in it, the idea that normalization is going to be this kind of final achievement after an Israeli peace agreement was frankly not believable to, I think, most Israelis. It felt like a kind of ultimatum or this kind of promise you make because it'll never get realized, because the reality was extremism and terrorism and so on. Reversing the order and making normalization feel real, making relations feel real, legitimizing the Jewish and Islamic relationship in particular, is very, very dramatic, with a potential to really shift the trajectory of the way in which the Middle East is moving. Now, there are counter forces there that are very powerful and very serious and need to be confronted. But for the first time, we also have, I think, a real thing to hold on to and develop to move things in a better direction. So the Abraham Accords are worthy of celebrating in this first year, and they're worthy of investing a great deal in. Perhaps I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Tal. What a brilliant presentation that was. We really appreciate it, and hopefully it will elicit some decent questions from the audience. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's over to you for tonight's proceedings. You'll see a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen called Reactions. You can hit that tab and then press the raised hand feature. That will provide me with a silent notification of your intention to ask Tal a question, and I hope that there are many of them. I will kick it off, Tal, and latching on to your final point about Abraham's tents and his hospitality. The question in the chat is, can you comment on the role of Saudi Arabia in the progress of the Abraham Accords?
Well, I can't comment directly, but I'll comment indirectly. And that will be to say, first of all, I mean, there's lots of commentary about the ways in which particularly Bahrain, but also the UAE, given their relationship with Saudi Arabia, would be unlikely to have been able to move forward with this without some kind of understanding from the Saudis in this respect. So I think that's worth noting. And of course, we have today aviation agreements that enable Israelis, Emiratis, Bahrainis to fly to each other's capitals and beyond, and that involves flying over Saudi airspace. And that obviously is an indicator of what the Saudi attitude towards this is. So in that sense, I think it's quite significant. There is the broader issue, of course, of the Israeli-Sunni convergence of interest with respect to the threat faced we face from Tehran. and that's also, I think, an important factor here. We're hopeful that in time we will be able to expand the Abraham Accords even further.
Thank you for that, Tal. I'll now hand over to AIJAC's Aaron Shapiro.
Thank you, Tal. It's really good to see you really energized behind with really good news to share, because so often your work that you do can be frustrating in many ways. But I wanted to ask about Lebanon. You know, we've seen Lebanon experience unprecedented economic troubles. They just formed a new government. We know about the Hezbollah presence that's so problematic and the threat that they pose. Is there any diplomatic leverage that could be used that you could see to somehow get a wedge of some sort to change the trajectory of Lebanon, which is, we know about the difficulties posed militarily. Is there a diplomatic opportunity?
Well, I mean, Lebanon is at the moment just a tragic story, and it's unfortunately not a surprising story. It's what happens when a country gets taken hostage by a terrorist organization and gets hollowed out over many, many years. There's obviously a lot of issues with corruption and lack of governance as well, but it begins, in my view, with the essential hostile takeover of a country by Iran and Hezbollah and the chaos that has produced. I think in terms of whether there is a diplomatic opening, it's an open question. I would say that the attitudes of different governments to the new Lebanese government will be significant. Obviously, Lebanon is in desperate need of financial assistance, IMF loans, aid, and so on. The degree to which countries are able to insist on certain measures being taken as part of that process will have some impact, but I don't know whether it will be dramatic, because at the end of the day, it's a situation where unless the reach and power of Iran is addressed significantly, Lebanon's situation will be permanently in that kind of tragic mode. And so really it's very hard to de-link the challenge of Lebanon from the challenge of Iran. And if there is diplomatic and other activity that's necessary, it really needs to be focused in that direction, in my view.
Thanks, Tal. I'll now take another question from the chat feed. To what extent, now you touched on it in your comments about the resilience of the Accords after and during and after the recent conflict in Gaza. So to that extent, to what extent will the demonization of Israel by Palestinian leaders make it difficult to engage with or make peace with the Palestinian people?
Well, I mean, as someone who's been doing this for a long time, some of you may have heard me say that I think one of the challenges in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has less to do with the issues in dispute and more to do with the kind of psychological mindset and kind of foundational narratives that affect this relationship. Unfortunately, for many Palestinians, the defining story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a conflict about the Jewish people and the Palestinian people trying to find a kind of accommodation between them, but it's a story that tries to say there is a victim and there is a villain. There is a kind of injustice that has been perpetrated by this villain who is very often described as a kind of foreign presence in the region. And when you look at that as if that's the story you tell about the conflict, resolving it becomes very difficult because you're essentially looking for Israel to somehow disappear or capitulate in some basic ways or apologize for its very existence. And I just don't see that being a justifiable or in any way realistic a component of any serious agreement, and certainly wouldn't be sustainable. My hope is, and it is, I have to say, it is a hope. I don't think there's yet evidence of this that you can point to, at least in a significant sense, that the Abraham Accords give expression and legitimize another idea. and that is that the Middle East, it sounds like it shouldn't be a revolutionary idea. It's kind of self-evident, but it is revolutionary, and that's kind of sad. And that is the Middle East is made up of different peoples who call it their home, who belong here. And one of those peoples is the Jewish people. Believe it or not, we are called Jews because we're the people of Judea. And this is the place where our story is told in large part. So the fact that the Abraham Accords recognizes that essentially, and that there are Arab states willing to speak in that way, I think gives more legitimacy and resonance to a kind of dialogue that will perhaps enable a different Palestinian voice to emerge over time. That doesn't mean we don't need to work today with the Palestinians to try to improve the situation. You know, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the fact that even problems you can't solve, you still should probably think about how to make them less big, right? And even gaps you can't close, you might consider narrowing. So there are things that we need to do in order to have the best possible relationship. But if you're talking about a transition towards genuine coexistence, I think it's going to be contingent on a kind of psychological shift, in my view, both in Israeli society and in Palestinian society, that will make people like me who deal with the negotiations be able better to reflect the sentiments of their society rather than push against those sentiments.
Fantastic answer. Thank you very much for that, Tal. I now hand over to AIJAC's Naomi Levine.
Thanks very much, Tal, and nice to see you again. We've spoken a lot about the impact of the Abraham Accords, both tonight and just generally this week, on the relationship between Israel and the UAE specifically. That seems to be where most of the achievements have been. What do you see as the coming achievements of the Abraham Accords with Israel and Sudan and with Morocco? Where are those relationships headed?
Right. Well, I mean, let's begin with Morocco. Morocco is a kind of really interesting case because it's not classically, certainly by the Moroccans, thought of in the same way. We have a long history of relationship with Morocco. We used to have a liaison office in Morocco. And most importantly, we have this kind of human bridge of the Moroccan Jewish community in Israel, which is so significant and large. My father is from Morocco, so it was particularly emotional for me to go to Rabat and be associated in that agreement. And we've already seen a boost in tourism and in economic relations, and a real kind of roadmap for where the Israeli-Moroccan relationship can develop. Minister Lapid was just there on a very successful visit. So the first answer is, I just see, as every kind of month and year passes, a deepening and expansion of these existing relationships beyond that. With Sudan, I mean, Sudan is also a very interesting case because of the transition that Sudan has undergone. Somewhat fragile transition still that needs to be taken into account. The symbolism there is immense because of the audience will probably know of the three no's of Khartoum of '67, where the Arab League, after the Six-Day War, said no negotiation, no peace, and no recognition with Israel. And then, so Sudan is very significant, but it's a country, it's on the African continent, and the dynamics there are a little bit different, and the process of developing that relationship needs to be tailored to each country. As I mentioned, we are certainly not resting on our laurels and just leaving it to those countries. And there are significant efforts to try to look at how to expand it, but you'll probably appreciate that I can't talk about that.
Thank you, Tal. I'll now hand over to AIJAC's Oved Labelle.
Hi, Tal. Thanks for doing this. I just wanted to ask, slightly tangentially, as the U.S. progressively disengages from the Middle East, or at least that's the perception, to what extent do you think Russia and China will fill the vacuum, and what are the likely ramifications for Israel in the region? And just going off of that, the UAE has managed to hedge its relationships with Russia, China, the US, Israel, and even Iran. If the US disengages, which way do you see the UAE tilting?
Yeah, well, I mean, much is made of this, what you call the US disengagement. I think the term itself is a little bit overstated. Certainly when it comes to Israel's relationship with the US, which is an unbelievably strong strategic alliance, regardless of administration. And I think the US commitment to Israel's security remains very strong. And frankly, the US engagement in the Middle East, even in a diminished form, is extremely significant. So in that sense, I think that it's sometimes a little bit overstated. I also have to say, I think it is important that one of the benefits of that perception is countries like Israel and the Sunni countries stepping up and saying we really need to take responsibility for pushing back against the extremist forces in the region and shaping it. And in that sense, I think it's very significant. As you know, Israel has good relations with Russia. We have good and economic relationship with China as well. None of those will ever or can ever be a replacement for our strategic relationship with the US. But we are, we do our best to maintain good and important relationships with those countries. Again, Minister Lapid was in Moscow just a few days ago in that respect. So, I mean, obviously, there's a constant concern as to whether extremist forces in the region will ever think that there's an opportunity to move forward. But they're going to do that anyway. The Iranians, are not waiting in that respect, and we are committed, together with the US, I think, to push back on those efforts.
Thank you, Tal. What I'll try and do is I've got quite a few questions in the chat. I'll see if I can link a couple of them together in the essence of time. So here's a question about the Biden administration vis-a-vis the Abraham Accords. Will the momentum of the Abraham Accords, which can be seen as an achievement of the previous administration, be prioritized by Secretary of State Blinken and the Democrats? And another question that can attach to that is, how do you think the rise of the Taliban may affect the Abraham Accords?
So, I mean, on the first question, I think it is very noteworthy that the US administration, especially given the tensions and divisions we see in the US, and even before the Biden administration came into office, was very supportive and congratulatory of the Abraham Accords. I think that's not a small thing. There's an anniversary taking place on the 1-year anniversary in Washington with the participation of members of the Trump administration. It's hard to imagine that happening on another issue. So I think that itself is symbolic of the new administration's commitment to this issue, and we are in good dialogue with them as to how to do it. At the same time, I think it's worthy, America has a lot of big priorities. There's the challenge of COVID and of climate and of China, and I think Israel has a big responsibility here to push and advance its own interests. We obviously want to work closely with the US administration on doing that, but we also need to be understanding, I think, that there are many, many priorities. I think even if you ask many Israelis, at the same time as we want to advance the Abraham Accords, we also have some other very pressing issues. And in foreign policy, you've also got to make sure that you're moving everything in parallel. With respect to the Taliban, I don't want to pretend to be an expert on Afghanistan. I did paradoxically, I did my doctorate on September 11th and Afghanistan, but I think it's a little, for me at least, I've read a lot of the analyses of what it means, but I think it's too early to tell what the Taliban's rise in Afghanistan means for the broader Middle East and for these issues. I would think that the rise of yet another and the empowerment of another Sunni extremist group with the potential for jihadist forces once again finding a safe haven there would be something that is of great concern, not just to Israel, but to other moderate Sunni countries. And so in a paradoxical way, precisely the rise of those kind of threats or potential threats are things that can push Israel and the more moderate Sunni Arab countries or more pragmatic Sunni Arab countries together. So without kind of saying anything definitive, my initial reaction is that the rise in extremism probably is yet another catalyst for investing more in these kind of relationships. Frankly, this is not something that is going to be undone. I really feel the irreversible nature of these decisions. If things are going well, we're going to try to make them go better. And if things are going bad, we're going to try to fix them. And in that sense, I think that the Abraham Accords are just going to grow and grow.
Thank you, Tal. I'll now hand over to Dr. Run Parat.
Hi, Tal. Good to hear from you. My question is there a momentum that is building up following the Abraham Accords? And just a little scoop, if you can tell us who's the next country to be part of this set of agreements?
Well, I think there was a question about whether there was momentum with the change of administration, and particularly with the round of violence in Gaza. But what we've seen in practice, as I mentioned, was first in the existing relationships, a willingness to double down and invest in them more. And behind the scenes, I can tell you that there are continuing efforts to see how it can be expanded, which I very much hope that it will be. And I see that the efforts are there. These are complicated dynamics, but I am very hopeful that we will see more and more steps in this direction. And I'm sorry, but I will not be generous enough to share with you the potential candidates in the line.
Thank you for that, Tal. I'll now hand over to Anthony Cohen.
Thank you, Tal, for your insights. To what extent A, the leadership, and B, the person in the street of Egypt and Jordan have taken the Abraham Accords?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question because we've asked ourselves a lot whether we can somehow leverage the Abraham Accords to shift the dynamic of the relationships, particularly between the peoples in Egypt and Jordan. At the moment, I think there isn't a huge amount of evidence for that, unfortunately. I think part of that has to do with the way those countries are much more associated with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and with the kind of scars of that. Unfortunately, they also have forces within those countries who are much more engaged in incitement and education of extremism and a kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric that is pretty, unfortunately, deeply embedded. So it's an important effort, but I think it's a long road. We have improving and very important relationships with the Hashemite Kingdom. We have an amazingly important strategic relationship with Egypt, but we are still facing that challenge of translating that into something deeper. And I can't say that the Abraham Accords have yet produced that kind of transformation in those societies.
Thank you for that, Tal. I'll now hand over to Kyle Orton.
Hi, thanks for doing this. There was a recent meeting between the UAE and Turkey, and one of the Abraham Accords, at least unspoken efforts, was to balance the Turks as well as Iran. Do you think this is going to lead to anything? I mean, will the UAE get warmer relations with Turkey, or is Turkey trying to break up these relations by doing this? Or, in other words, what do we think Erdogan is really up to?
Well, I mean, in the Middle East, everyone is trying to balance their relationships and their interests. And so that means very often having a dialogue and a formal relationship with countries, even though you have many significant differences with. So I wouldn't associate too much to that. I mean, the UAE has a dialogue with the Iranians as well, even though their differences there are very stark. I think Turkey's Erdogan is under significant stress at the moment. And as you see, I think Erdogan is sending quite a few signals that it's of a need to kind of rethink or course correct, given the challenges, particularly economic, but some others that Turkey is facing. And that may also be an opportunity of sorts to moderate some of Turkey's more dangerous behavior. Turkey was one of the few countries that vocally spoke out against the Abraham Accords. Very interestingly, at the time, you might remember that the Palestinians tried to bring a resolution in the Arab League to condemn the Abraham Accords, and that resolution did not pass. And that was a kind of unprecedented event that the Palestinians were not able to pass a resolution in the Arab League in that respect. But Turkey did speak out against it. I think it's been less vocal lately. Frankly, even if it was in their interest to try to harm that relationship, it is not within their capacity, in my view.
Thank you, Tal. Now, for the penultimate question, before I hand over to Jeremy for the final question, I'll give the floor to Colin.
Tal, thank you very much again for excellent presentation, as of course we expected. But since you've spoken about Turkey, the other leg of the double, you've got to say something about Iran. Of course, you pointed out that the negative threatening influences in the region to both the Arab Sunni world and Israel are bringing them together. And at the core of those threats, of course, happens to be Iran and all of its proxies around the region. I'm just wondering now how you see the Iran issue being handled. Does the alliance represented by the Accords help in terms of persuading the United States not to do a runner and to cave in again? Is there a chance that Washington will be able to finesse and handle this in an effective, responsible way? Again, is this new relationship embodied by the Abraham Accord something that, will give much more substance to the genuine reservations which Israel and its Arab colleagues have about this, overridingly significant issue?
Yeah, well, you're certainly right that it's highly significant. And I think, it's no secret that we have a pretty significant difference about the return to the JCPOA. But what's been equally, I think, significant is the willingness of both the US administration and Israel to have an intensive kind of quiet dialogue about this issue. And I think, frankly, it has helped a great deal for there to be this visible convergence of interests between Israel and some of the other states in the region on this issue. In reality, what we've seen, I think, is Iran not just unwilling to return to the JCPOA, but exploiting that negotiating process in order to advance its nuclear program, create more leverage, and continue unabated in its regional aggressive ambitions. What that's done, I think, is actually create an opportunity for a dialogue between Israel and the US and others about what an alternative approach might look like, given that the JCPOA negotiations are in the state that they're in. The administration itself has spoken about the idea of moving beyond the JCPOA to a longer and stronger arrangement. But regardless of whether that happens, I think the election of Raisi and the kind of radicalism of the regime in everything it's doing at the moment, without, I have to say, a lot of finesse or a very effective mechanism of concealing it, has made, as I think in a way, created an opportunity to think very seriously about what is being called in some places a Plan B. And I think in that sense, there is a genuine opening for dialogue and good coordination with respect to this very, very serious challenge.
Thank you, Tal, and thank you, audience members, for your questions tonight. They were fantastic and continued on the brilliant presentation that Tal gave at the front of the webinar. Now, for the final question, I'll hand over to AIJAC's Jeremy Jones.
Thank you, Tal. My question is about the impact of the Abraham Accords in two areas. One is in international organizations, institutions, the United Nations, other institutions, where Israel's ability to contribute has been blocked in so many ways, about the impact there. The second is the impact in our region. Indonesia, our near neighbor, often has an eye to what's going on in the Middle East. And obviously the Southeast Asian nations extend beyond Indonesia. So I'm curious if what you have seen or what you think might happen with the impact of the Abraham Accords in those two areas.
So on the international organization front, unfortunately, as you know, I think many of the forums are the kind of bastion where that kind of criminalization of Israel takes place. They're kind of If you look at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the General Assembly and others, where Israel is really singled out, those are I think, unfortunately, we haven't seen much change in that respect. The slight changes in the voting patterns to some extent, which might be associated to some extent with the Abraham Accords. But these are places in which a kind of automatic majority operates. Frankly, I've always felt that the main victims of that kind of double standard is the credibility of the organizations engaged in it. Obviously, Israel doesn't want these biased resolutions, is opposed to them. But more often than not, I think to fair-minded observers, the resolutions make the organizations look ridiculous and lack any real effective impact or credibility in what they're doing. And you take the Human Rights Council, it following the Gaza confrontation, it just set up yet another commission of inquiry, this time a permanent one. And it's appointed to that commission 3 heads who are known for their anti-Israel positions. And it's called an independent and impartial inquiry. So people who have already a fixed position on a conflict that they're meant to investigate independently and impartially, I don't know who takes this seriously. And in that sense, I think it's more of a tragedy for the international organization system than it is for Israel. And unfortunately, I think it will take a lot to change. Our goal is to speak the truth and to engage to the extent we can, but to also stand against that kind of hypocrisy. With respect to Indonesia, I mean, you guys are the experts much more than me, so I can imagine Colin giving a great lecture on that topic. My sense is, Indonesia, generally speaking, has an opportunity to represent a version of Islam that is desperately needed in the Middle East. And they now have partners in the Middle East who are moving in that direction. So I'm hopeful that it can create the space for a little bit more courage from Jakarta and the willingness to be in good company in improving relations with Israel for the benefit, first and foremost, of Indonesia, but also I think, and I think, frankly, Indonesia's broader role as a kind of leader of a more quiet and moderate version of Islam that is really important for the economic benefit of Indonesia, and obviously, I think a message for the broader part of the world which you guys come from and I grew up in. And perhaps I'll end on this note, which I've always felt is a good symbol for the Abraham Accords, and it touches on your question, Jeremy. There's that wonderful Aesop's fable where the sun and the wind compete as to who can take off someone's coat. He's got a jacket on, and the wind says, I'm gonna get this guy to take his coat off. And the wind blows very, very hard, and it makes the man just hold on to his coat that much harder. And then the sun says, let me try. And the sun comes out and it's warm. And the man says, well, it's warm, I'm going to take off my jacket. And in a way, that's the kind of choice that a lot of countries face, and the way in which I think about the Abraham Accords. The idea that through pressure and attempted delegitimization of Israel, something good is going to come of it, except for Israel holding on to its coat that much tighter, I think is proven to be wrong, and it's not an effective approach, and it's not a fair approach, frankly. The idea that simply by creating more opportunity, by letting the sun come out and creating more opportunity and benefit for the people who belong to the Middle East, for the people of the world, so that people actually want to engage and find ways to accommodate one another and to be tolerant of one another, seems to be a more effective strategy and a more decent strategy. And I hope in time, this year of the Abraham Accords will become, celebrated not just every year, but every year we'll have more and more to celebrate, and people will benefit from it. And given who I am and where I work, I hope Israel will benefit from it the most and a lot. But I hope that there'll be enough for everyone to enjoy the fruits and the dividends of this incredibly important investment. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. On that note, on behalf of everyone here at AIJAC and the audience, Tal, thank you so much for what a brilliant presentation tonight. 1 year on from the Abraham Accords, we can take a lot from tonight, and we can look forward to what seems and what hopefully will be a very bright future. I do hope that the next time I get to see you, Tal, will be in person when you come and address our Rumbum groups that we hope to launch as soon as we're able to. But as I said, on behalf of AIJAC, thank you so much for your brilliant presentation tonight. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please be on the lookout for the invitation for our next webinar, which will be on Wednesday, the 6th of October at noon with Erwin Kotler and Dr. Karen Mock. That's all we have time for tonight. On behalf of everyone at AIJAC, Gamar Chatima Tova, well over the fast, and we look forward to seeing you for our next webinar on October the 6th. Bye for now.